So the question was asked, who is worse, FDR or Wilson? Most people automatically say FDR. Entitlement programs, Social Security, getting off the gold standard, raising income taxes, having 3 unprecedented presidential terms, yada, yada, yada. Okay, I get it. Not saying that you're wrong, but let me remind you of this Woodrow Wilson fella. Woodrow Wilson was kind of a philosopher king. He was heavily influenced by a fella named Walter Lippmann, who expressed the ideology that all previous human history had been adrift until the societal planners came to save the day. And guess who Wilson thought of himself as? That's right, folks. A planner. A societal planner. Yeah, who needs him? Well, Walter Lippmann was a confessed socialist, but he eased up by being a proponent of this new progressive movement. There's this book, Patriot's History of the United States by Larry Schweikart, and he explains some of this on pages 460 and 461. Wilson was a philosopher king, believing that utilitarianism, science and technology really trumped faith, morals, and values in society. Yet, being a prudent and pragmatic figure, Wilson seized on the social gospel movement that was really taking sway across the country. I mean, Schweikart mentions this also on pages 497 and 498 in his book. The idea of social justice over perfecting the inner man through prayer, meditation, and biblical study became the mantra of organized religion at the time. And social justice proponents translated this into endorsement of minimum wages, labor laws, redistribution of wealth, and regulating greedy businesses. Well, Wilson rode that tide and created a little administration called the Federal Trade Commission, the government agency that investigates business practices in the private sector. Thank you. Yeah, that was Wilson. But more notably, under the Wilson administration, the creation of the Federal Reserve, yes, folks, the Fed, that was Wilson's baby, also came into play. The Federal Reserve notes would replace money backed by gold and silver. And hey, that was a great setup for FDR to get us off the gold standard. Let me not go there. Let's talk Constitution, John Doe. Under the Wilson administration, there were 3 amendments that came into play with the Constitution. The 16th Amendment, hello, federal income tax. Yes, that was Wilson. And let us not all forget that a heavily graduated progressive income tax was one of the planks of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Right in here, folks. Yeah, thanks, Wilson. 17th Amendment was an interesting one. This was the direct election of U.S. senators. Now, think about this a little bit. Why would Wilson want that? Well, prior to this amendment, U.S. senators were actually sent and elected by their state legislatures. Why was this? Well, all of these federal laws that were being passed had these programs that needed to be funded. But when you take a look at the actual funding, the funding doesn't just come from federal monies. These programs need to also pony up from the state coffers as well. With the U.S. senators having accountability to their state legislatures and effectively the state coffers, that was sort of a check and balance to make sure that federal spending could be kept under control at the federal level. Well, Wilson took care of that, folks. No accountability there now. Now, who can forget about the 18th Amendment? This was the abolition of alcohol. And this underscores Wilson's propensity for social engineering, because really the social engineering aspect was a purpose put in place for the government to implement things that the government saw desirable. In this case, having better health. But it's interesting because the whole social engineering thing sort of breaks down with the progressive when it comes down to instituting morals and values in society. How ironic is that? Anyway, let's move on to foreign policy. Let's just put aside the fact that Wilson actually resegregated the military under his administration. Yeah, that happened. Anyway, let's talk about League of Nations, because this is social science at its best here. World War I erupted under the Wilson administration, and granted, that was really not his fault in terms of what went on in Europe at the time. But Wilson did bring us into World War I, and justifiably so. I think he should have done it sooner, but hindsight's 2020. Wilson assembled a crack team of academic experts to define an outlook on foreign policy that would outline the ideal conditions that needed to take place at the conclusion of World War I. The 14th point was the League of Nations. This was the precursor to the United Nations that we have today. Yeah, Wilson planted that seed. His 14 points were followed by 4 principles and 5 particulars. Because, once a social planner, always a social planner. And, why stop at the borders of the U.S.? Let's just take it to the whole world. Anyway, Wilson was also a fan of a little-known book called Philip Drew Administrator. Glenn Beck talks about this a lot when he talks about Wilson. The whole premise of Philip Drew Administrator was that, there was this sort of fourth branch in the U.S. government, the administrative branch. And there was sort of a way that the administrative branch could have an overarching rule and creep into people's lives and encroach on people's personal freedoms and liberties through administrative regulation. When Congress passes these laws, there are volumes and volumes of regulations that derive from those very laws. Well, who writes those regulations? It's not Congress. It's some administrative bureaucrat. Well, newsflash, folks, take a look at the Bureau of Regulatory Affairs today and people like Cass Sunstein. I mean, this is the kind of stuff. This is the reason why we have to use certain light bulbs and make sure that our toilets don't flush more than 1.5 gallons. Whatever. Anyway, to sum up, Woodrow Wilson, philosopher king, social planner, science and technology over morals and values, created the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, jacked up our Constitution, and created the League of Nations, which would ultimately fail, but set the stage for something like the UN. All of these are pieces of evidence that, when considered in its entirety, jump-started the progressive era and set up future presidents such as FDR, LBJ, and Obama to further entrench statism in our freedom-loving, God-fearing country. So when asked, which is worse, FDR or Wilson? No matter what your answer, you won't be wrong.